Nadia's Triumph, a 100 Halls short story. The greatest magics occur at the precipice of life and death, said patron Malden Antarist to a roomful of Coterie students on their first day of the new year. The words hung in the air, poignant and indecipherable, just the way Nadia knew that Malden liked it. The students around her shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with the ambiguity, while Nadia let a light smirk rise to her lips. Under normal circumstances, a man who looked like Malden Antarist would have been unremarkable. He had an ordinary face with a just-so nose. He stood an average height, was within the standard weight, not too fit but not even remotely chubby. Even his hair was a typical brown, not even artfully tinged with grey to make him appear wiser. But within him was a spark that burned so bright Nadia had seen celebrities fumble their words when they met him. His gestures signified a strength of purpose, a clarity of vision. Even the barest arching of the eyebrow contained multitudes. A sharp elbow found her ribs as her younger sister, Alison, a first-year student at the Coterie of Mages, who was seated next to her, whispered, "Is he always like this?" As Malden continued to lecture at the head of the auditorium about the limits of magic, Nadia cupped her hand over her mouth and replied, "He makes these grand statements to keep the illusion up that he's all-powerful, dangerous even, but don't let that fool you. He actually cares." Alison sat up taller, scrutinizing the head of the magical hall. Nadia knew what her sister was thinking. Could the head of the most powerful hall in Invictus really have a soft heart? It had taken a lot of convincing to get her to join Coterie, rather than Arcanium or Animalians. Either one might have been a better fit on the surface, but Nadia knew that this hall would get the best from her sister, as it had for her. When patron Malden asked for questions, a first-year's hand went up in back, a girl with an afro and freckles. "I heard that head patron Invictus is missing. Is that true?" she asked. Nadia sat taller. The rumor had reached her during the summer break, but she'd blown it off at the time. That those rumors had persisted was worrisome to say the least. Patron Malden cocked a smile. "Head patron Invictus has lived for a very long time. I doubt there's anything alive that can kill him." "But no one has seen him since earlier this year," said the first year. "True. But he frequently disappears on important missions that only he knows about, so I don't think there's any need to worry," said Malden. Nadia shifted in her seat. Whenever someone told her not to worry, she always felt like it meant the source of the concern was real. But she also couldn't imagine that Invictus could be dead, because that would throw the magical university into chaos. Patron Malden took more questions, which Nadia didn't care about because they dealt with topics one could easily learn about online. Then a first-year student asked one that made her take notice. "I heard Coterie Mages get to learn about demon summoning. Is that true?" asked a guy in the back row. Patron Malden paced across the front of the room with his fingers steepled. "Demon summoning is an aberration of magic, which will only tear apart the fabric of this world. I recognize that the motto of this hall is limitless, but I hope you understand it is meant as a measure of imagination. Know that there are and will be limits while you are a member of this hall. Demon summoning is one of those limits. Not only is it extremely difficult, but it is dangerous, not only to the mage in question, but to the city itself." "Why is that?" asked the first year. "Because the act of summoning is to forcibly drag a creature from another realm into this one to do your bidding. The very act of that violence rips the barrier between this one and the next apart, having unpredictable consequences. The risk is not worth the reward," he said. The answer got a lot of nods from the younger mages, who were still getting used to the idea that the boundaries of their abilities had just expanded immensely, and that came with risks. Another first year, a handsome guy on the far right, raised his hand. "What happens if you encounter someone summoning a demon? What do you do?" Patron Malden raised an eyebrow as a grin rose to his lips. "For you, my boy, I would recommend running as fast as you can the other way." The whole class erupted in good-natured amusement, and crimson stained the questioner's cheeks. A fellow first year patted him on the shoulder. But seriously, said Patron Malden with a wink, run really fast. Nadia let the mirth heave her stomach, and her sister was nearly doubled over with the back of her hand over her mouth. As the wave of laughter subsided, Alison glanced up at Nadia with a sparkle of enjoyment in her gaze, an acknowledgement that she was glad she'd chosen this hall. A point of sisterly pride for Nadia. Enough with my lecturing, said Patron Malden. Let's see if our advanced students have been paying attention in class. Nadia, what's the first rule of stopping a demon summoning? As all eyes fell upon her, Nadia sat up taller and raised her chin as she spoke. The first rule is that if it's already started, you're probably too late. Good, said Patron Malden with a nod in her direction. It brought a kernel of warmth to her midsection. Victoria, the second. On the left side of the auditorium, Victoria Dreadmarsh sat surrounded by her gang of sycophants. Today her hair was a mix of jet black and silvery blonde. Using enchantments to change one's hair color wasn't particularly difficult, but Victoria made it so damn artful that Nadia reached up and touched her own black hair in response. The second rule is that the energies to close a portal are greater than opening it because the summoner has had a head start. Victoria let a grin rise to her lips. Of course, the best method would be to convince the demon to leave of its own accord, but if you could do that, you'd be the greatest mage ever in the 100 halls. Her answer brought laughter to the auditorium. Excellent, said Patron Malden with a hand raised toward Victoria as the class beamed their smiles at her. As the patron continued to lecture, Alison said under her breath, "Who's that?" "She's gorgeous." "She has the soul of a gorgon," said Nadia, scowling. "Her parents own half the property in Invictus, only the alchemist patron is richer than they are." Alison's forehead wrinkled as she tucked a strand of honey-brown hair behind her ear. "I bet she's not very good then, if she's had mommy and daddy's money all these years." Nadia sighed. "No, actually she's really good, which makes her even more annoying." She was so busy focusing her ire upon Victoria, Nadia hadn't realized the class had stopped and everyone was staring at her. "Nadia," asked the patron. "Yes," asked Nadia as her gut sunk into her knees. "I was asking if you would like to join me for a demonstration," he said. Nadia banished her embarrassment as she climbed to her feet. "Yes, patron, I would love to." As she made her way to the head of the auditorium, he gestured towards Victoria. "Of course." Nadia took position on one side of the patron, readying herself for a mage duel, relieved that she'd chosen to wear loose clothing. The dark black boots over leggings and her asymmetrical grey coat were dressy enough to go out to the smoke and amber, but not confining enough that she couldn't manage her spells. Victoria stood on the other side of the patron wearing striped paper bag shorts and a floral blouse that managed to thread the needle between casual bohemian and runway model. "My older students will know this game," said Patron Malden as he pressed a button on the desk. The floor opened up smoothly and a colorful wheel rose up, coming to a stop at chest height. The circle was demarcated with dozens of slices on which the names of various objects, such as block of wood, hunk of hematite, or mercury orb, were written. Like a game show host, Patron Malden gestured towards the latest addition to the room. Wheel of Magic. As I said before, the hall motto, Limitless, is about creativity. The best mages aren't just filled with useful spells or overflowing with fays, but so clever you could cut yourself on their wit. They perceive things others can't see, make connections that allow them to break through the expectations of what has been done before. This game is a training ground to develop that creativity. We will spin the wheel 3 times. The first time for an item, the second for an element, and the final time for a reagent. From these 3, our mages will construct an avatar homunculus, which will do battle in a miniature arena to see which one of our students is the cleverest. As Nadia blew out a cleansing breath, she couldn't help but notice the absolute adoration from her younger sister. She was counting on Nadia to win the contest, which wasn't going to be easy since she'd never beaten Victoria at the game. While there was nothing but pride on the line, Nadia didn't want to look bad in front of her sister. Let's start with Victoria, said Patron Malden. He snapped his fingers and the wheel spun rapidly, the many colors becoming a rainbow blur. As it slowed down, the clicks from the wooden flipper built the tension in the room. While the end result would require magical creativity on both their parts, certain items and reagents made it easier than others. Steel balls, said Patron Malden. Nadia inwardly groaned. It was an excellent starting item. The patron snapped his fingers to change the wheel and start it spinning again, this time with only 5 sections: fire, water, air, earth and force, spirit. When it stopped spinning, it was on force or spirit depending on how you used it. Combined with steel balls, it was a strong start for Victoria. Nadia had to hope that the reagent was something less compatible with those items, like mattercore droppings or craterbird feathers, but her gut completed a full revolution when it landed on Banshee tears, which besides being a powerful enabler had ubiquitous uses, giving Victoria a wealth of options. Low whistles from the older students in the crowd signaled that her odds of winning had gone down considerably. Alison glanced at the others, a look of consternation on her face. Quite a start for you, Victoria, said Patron Malden. Sometimes you get lucky, she said, adding a short curtsy. Nadia refocused on the wheel as the patron set it spinning. Going second was a disadvantage, because it meant that her opponent had more time to formulate their creation. Nadia needed to squeeze every moment she could out of the competition. As the wheel slowed to a stop, it appeared to rest at razor wire before slipping over to paper sheets, which was the absolute weakest item on the wheel. During the next spin, Nadia considered what kind of avatars she might construct based on the element. For Earth, she could make a cannon or living bomb. Fire, while seemingly counterintuitive, with the fuel source of paper, might be able to destroy the links between the steel balls, rendering them ineffective. Without a doubt, the element she least wanted was air due to its weakness against force. As the wheel slowed to a stop, Nadia knew that it would end up on the least desirable element. Air, said Patron Malden in a tone that was almost apologetic. He tilted his head as if to say, how unfortunate. By the time the wheel was spinning a third time, Nadia had a half-dozen ideas on what to do with the paper and element of air, but none of them were strong enough against Victoria's trio. She wasn't even paying attention to the wheel when it stopped, but knew it wasn't good by the heavy groans that passed through the crowd. Darian Rutherford, a fellow fourth year, called out, Nadia should get a do-over. You can't win with that combination. The older students nodded in agreement with Darian, with various levels of intensity. When Nadia glanced back to the board to see the clacker on copper dust, she understood their concern. If she didn't know how warded the wheel was against tampering, she might have thought Victoria had spelled it to land that way. It was the worst possible combination. Patron Malden let the disagreement rise momentarily, before giving the simmer-down gesture. No faith in dear Nadia. He smirked as the volume lowered. That's not how this game goes anyway. Sometimes you get dealt a bad hand and you have to do the best you can with it. But the truth is that all hands are winnable if you're willing to pay the right price. He stepped back and gestured to both of them. Ladies, you may begin. 15 minutes. Nadia threw herself into the work. There were 2 large workbenches on either side of the room behind a large privacy screen. The audience could watch them work, but they couldn't see each other. Nadia pulled out a stack of parchment and a cup of copper dust. With only the air element at her disposal, she had limited options. The first decision was the manner of homunculus she would construct. Paper, especially the thicker parchment, could be made stronger with the right folding techniques. After all, cardboard was just paper and glue. Nadia tentatively folded a few pieces, deciding if she could make a walking creature that could leverage Victoria's out of the arena. But she knew that bipedal creatures would be too easy to counter, especially if her opponent made a shifting steel ball golem, which was the most obvious and powerful option. There were 2 ways to win. The first was to push your opponent out of the arena, while the second was to destroy them. The first was the most common victory, because it was the easiest, but it would be the strategy Victoria was expecting. She tapped on the bowl of copper dust. It was a great reagent for making potions involving skin and transformation, but terrible for powering enchantments. As she rubbed the back of her head, she realized that was the problem with her items. They were unsuited for what she needed them to do. Since she couldn't trade them out for other things, her only recourse was to transform them in their current forms. During the summer, to prepare for her advanced alchemical chemistry class, she'd been studying the books and watching online videos, because making a mistake in a higher level class didn't just result in a bad grade but possibly a gross deformation or death. Last year, a first year screwing around with a piece of portal obsidian accidentally sent their left arm to Miami. They died before a spell or tourniquet could be applied. Copper dust was a weak reagent, but copper carbonate was much stronger. The carbonate form was what happened to copper after years of weathering. The copper roofs on some of the houses in the first ward had that pleasant greenish patina. But the problem was that it required years to transform, and she needed to do it in minutes. First it had to be oxidized, then it picked up sulfur to form a cupric sulfide, and finally it could be transformed into carbonate. Nadia dumped the copper dust into a beaker and put it over a burner. To facilitate the oxidation, she inhaled a great breath of air, filling it with phase. When she exhaled into the beaker of copper dust, Nadia concentrated it with the element of air. By the time all the air was out of her lungs, the bright orange dust was black as coal. Next, she ripped up pieces of the parchment and shoved them into the mixture before taking a torch and blowing flame directly onto it, burning the parchment, which would release the bits of sulfur from the collagen wax into the copper. For the last part, she inhaled again, using the air element to concentrate the mixture. The presence of phase along with the air burnt carbon from the paper and released sulfates and carbon dioxide, speeding up the process until sparkles of green formed on the black dust. She had to do 3 rounds of it before she thought she had enough copper carbonate for what she planned to do. Maybe 10% of the copper dust had been transformed, but it would have to be enough because she only had 6 minutes left. Now that she had a higher quality of reagent to work with, she had to decide how best to fashion her paper into an avatar. With more time, she could fold the parchment hundreds of times, using magic to compress the material, to create an object almost as hard as steel, much as blacksmiths fold metal to create strong swords. But she didn't have hours, she only had a handful of minutes. Brute force wasn't going to win the battle against Victoria's creation. It would have to be guile and subterfuge. With 4 minutes left, Nadia decided on the shape and began folding the paper furiously, fingers bending and creasing the parchment with expert acumen, adhering the copper carbonate to the exterior of the homunculus with a breath of phase. When she was finished, she grabbed the piece of jade wrapped in gold wire that would help her control the creation and stuck it with a touch of glue, a moment before Patron Malden called out time. The screens were removed, and Nadia approached the center of the room while Victoria approached from her side with a pile of steel balls in her hand that shifted like an excited rope. Nadia, Victoria, please place your avatars in the arena and put your controlling pendants on, said the patron. While she'd been working, the arena, a round table with foot-high walls roughly 15 feet in diameter, had been set in front of the class. The angled seating of the auditorium gave a good view of the battle area. Victoria set hers down first, drawing in breaths from the crowd as the pile of steel balls curled itself into a coiled snake. A golem would have been sturdier, but the snake shape gave it more agility and reach, which was a problem for Nadia's creation. The light green round tube with a cone front did little to inspire excitement from the crowd, until the sparrow's wings fluttered momentarily when Nadia placed the controlling pendant around her neck. Nadia looked across at her opponent, the fashionable Victoria Dreadmarsh, who wore the mask of a warrior. There would be no underestimating from her opponent. Victoria planned to destroy her. When Patron Malden began the countdown, Nadia took a deep breath, calming her fluttering heart, and pushed the sounds of the students shuffling in their seats out of her mind. Begin. As Nadia lifted her arm to signal to her paper bird to rise into the air, the steel snake snapped out like a lightning strike. She had to funnel extra phase into the pendant to push her bird higher to avoid the deadly strike, which reached across the arena faster than she'd thought possible. The head of the steel snake barely missed her paper bird, then landed with a heavy thud on the arena floor. Nadia breathed a sigh of relief. Had the snake hit, her bird would have been demolished and the match over. She couldn't help but hear her younger sister call out encouragement. Having avoided the initial strike, Nadia let her paper bird circle around the arena, being careful not to exit the airspace above it. The steel snake, under Victoria's direction, coiled into a ball at the center of the arena, head rotating hypnotically as it waited for the opportune time to strike. This presented two problems for Nadia and her paper bird. The first was that she had to keep moving to avoid an attack, and second, a coiled snake didn't present a point of attack. The pile of steel balls was far too strong for her paper bird to penetrate. Nadia kept the bird flying in unexpected directions, being careful not to fall into any patterns that Victoria could exploit. She was shifting back across the arena when the steel snake shot up, clipping the back of the paper bird and spinning it across the arena. Slamming her guiding hand hard to the right, Nadia managed to keep the bird from careening out of the arena, but almost as soon as it landed, the snake shot over to finish the job. Nadia managed to get the bird into the air before the snake reached it, but the damage to the tail of the bird was severe, and the copper patterner cracked off, exposing the folded parchment beneath. But the double attack left the steel snake extended across the arena, exposing the gaps between the joints, which were held together with tubes of force. Nadia's bird dove to the center of the snake, before Victoria could slip it away. The belly of her paper bird split open, expanding around the steel balls, capturing its midsection. While Nadia's materials for her paper bird were less than inspiring, there were others available in the heat of battle. Copper carbonate was useful for a protective layer, but it also had a secondary benefit. It combined with banshee tears to form a powerful explosive. Nadia sent a trigger through the paper bird, forcing the copper carbonate to react with the excess reagent on the steel snake, then followed it up with a healthy push of phase. The explosion flashed a bright white light, which briefly blinded Nadia. Through the gasp from the crowd, she heard steel balls clanging together in what she hoped were the bells of victory. But when the spots retreated from her eyes, she was presented with a scene of destruction for her paper bird. While the steel snake looked drunken as it slithered back across the arena, the bindings between its many parts loosened. The explosion hadn't been enough to destroy her opponent's avatar. Her paper bird had not only failed to destroy the snake, but it had destroyed itself in the process. She shook her head incredulously. It should have been enough, even with the loss of carbonate. There was no way that Victoria could channel enough phase to hold it together through the explosion. No one was that strong. The only thing she could think was that Victoria had cheated somehow. Her avatar looked like a blowtorch had been taken to the back end. As she activated the pendant, the left wing gave a single sick flutter before failing to respond. "The victory goes to Victoria Dreadmarsh," said Patron Malden, starting a vigorous applause from the audience. "Excellent work, Miss Dreadmarsh." The snake was a well-constructed avatar. Victoria beamed at the crowd, throwing a wink towards Nadia as she strutted back to her seat, which felt like a dagger in the gut. "That is the end of class," said the patron to the auditorium. "You may return to your studies, except for the first years, who will stay here for a quick discussion." As the rest of the class filed out, Nadia poked her charred paper bird. Her sister approached the arena with wide eyes. "That was awesome, Nadia. Even if you didn't win." Nadia pushed up a smile for her sister's sake. Victoria always seemed to have her number. Before she could leave the front of the auditorium, Patron Malden said, "You should be proud of that match, Miss Park. That was a clever solution, to upgrade your materials, changing the copper dust to copper carbonate, and then try to combine it with Victoria's reagent." "But it didn't work," said Nadia, swallowing back her pain. I didn't win. No, you didn't, said Patron Malden, bunching his lips up. But take that as a lesson for next time. What could you have done differently? The match was winnable. You proved that, but you didn't deliver. Next time you might need to dig a little deeper to win. You have to push yourself to the limit. Inside, Nadia wanted to rage scream to accuse Victoria of cheating, but that wasn't what was expected in the Coterie of Mages. Instead she nodded and said, "Thank you, Patron Malden. I will work harder next time." Good, he said with a wink. Limits can't be exceeded without first mastering yourself. Nadia left the room as her sister and the other first years gathered around Patron Malden. As she closed the door to the auditorium, his words hit her right in the back of the head. So, which one of you will become the next Victoria Dreadmarsh? The next few weeks Nadia saw little of her sister, both because they were busy with their classes and so Alison could make her own opinion of the prestigious hall. Nadia was in a lower section of the obelisk, the home of Coterie, near one of the larger kill rooms, when she heard a pained squeal that sounded like her sister. She ran to the partially open door and found the wards deactivated. She hooked her fingers in the gap and pulled it wide. The room beyond was about 60 feet across with a domed ceiling and concrete walls covered in glass, which in turn were covered in runes. Between the reinforced concrete and the thick transparent glass were faint ghostly forms that shifted ominously. The room was made for containing dangerous magics, should they get out of control. The deathgeists in the walls could kill everything in the room if certain conditions were met, leaving a gruesome scene before they faded back to wherever it was they originated. Nadia couldn't imagine a place that would spawn such a creature, nor how they could capture them, but they served a terrible purpose. At the center of the room was a mash of students from which a strong scent of phase, it smelled like burnt ozone, emanated. Nadia immediately recognized Victoria's tall blonde coif in the circle. When Alison's high-pitched shriek hit her ears, Nadia yelled, "Get the hell away from my sister." Her fingers danced into the beginnings of a stun spell, which would be the only way she might survive a battle against a large group, and everyone turned towards her, confusion raining on their faces. "What the hell are you doing, Nadia?" asked Victoria, who wore a jet-black pantsuit with a V-neck front. With hands held in front, fingers curled into the beginnings of a spell, it was Nadia's turn to be confused as she surveyed the complete lack of menace in their expressions. From behind the group, Alison's voice erupted. "Nadia!" She pushed through the crowd, her expression faltering when they locked gazes. Her sister looked a little out of breath. Heat rose to Nadia's cheeks as she resisted the urge to flee the room. I heard screaming," she said. Victoria gave a theatrical huff and rolled her eyes. "Nads, you're always so serious. Lighten up." Nadia gritted her teeth. She hated when Victoria called her Nads, but knew better than to draw attention to it. "Sorry Vix, but this is a kill room, a place where dangerous shit happens. Don't you think it might have been poor judgment to do whatever the hell you were doing in this room?" said Nadia. "Nads dear," said Victoria with a bunched up smile, "don't be so afraid of a little fun. I use this room all the time. It's not dangerous if you know what you're doing. We were playing this fabulous new version of 5 Elements that I made up. Winners get rewards and losers get penalties. You're not a stick in the mud sister, I might add, is quite good at the game, and has received 3 rewards in a row." When Alison blushed, Nadia realized what was going on. She'd heard about the game from some of the other students. There were alchemical agents that could cause brief pleasure or pain. "It's still stupid to be using this room. An accident could get you all killed," said Nadia. "Fine," said Victoria, "we'll leave. Come on boys and girls, Nanny Nads doesn't want us to get hurt. I know a better spot to play." Nadia didn't receive any elbows as they passed her, but it felt that way. While she'd never been anyone's favorite in Coterie, she'd done a good job of not making anyone hate her. Even her rivalry with Victoria had been cordial up until this point. She was afraid that had changed for the worse. Alison slowed as she approached, her lips squeezed into a white line. Why did you have to do that? I'm sorry, sis. I didn't know. I heard you scream and I got worried, said Nadia. I'm not a child anymore, said Allison. No, you're not, but Coterie's not a place to mess around, said Nadia. Her younger sister brushed past her, leaving Nadia in the room alone. Afterwards she muttered to herself, nice move. Before she left, something on the ground near the far side of the room caught her eye. She made her way across and crouched down next to the bead of blood on the concrete. It was a single drop, completely liquid, which was unusual. The location of the blood was the other side of the room from Victoria's game, so she didn't think it had come from one of them, but leaving reagents in a kill room was a sure way to get a mage killed if they reacted unfavorably with an experiment. While it was regular procedure to scrub the room clean both before and after using a kill room, she didn't want someone to get injured if they weren't as thorough as they should be. Thankfully, she always kept a few small vials in her shoulder bag. Using a piece of cloth, Nadia soaked up the blood, then shoved it into the vial, stopping it after she was done. The remaining blood on the concrete, she burned away with a ball of flame summoned from her fist, leaving a small scar, which would encourage the next mage to pay extra attention to cleaning. Satisfied that she'd fixed the problem, Nadia left the kill room, shutting the door behind her and activating the door runes. Nadia found Patron Malden in the library that the professors used when they wanted privacy. He sat by the grand window that looked out at the spire, which on this grey late autumn day was partially obscured by the clouds. Patron Malden sat in a high-backed leather chair next to a crackling fire, which gave off little heat but provided a cozy ambience that made Nadia wish she had a book and an invitation to stay. Near his chair was a table, upon which rested a mug of what smelled like coffee, an ornate box that many of the professors used for snuff, and the latest Herald of the Halls. Her gut tightened when her gaze flitted across the latest headline, Is Invictus Dead? Quite the provocative headline, isn't it? Asked Malden, steepling his fingers. I asked Camilla not to publish it, but knew she wouldn't listen. Is it true? Asked Nadia tepidly. Malden glanced out the window and let out a sigh. At this point, it doesn't matter if it is or not. The world believes it so now and will act accordingly. The candidness of her patron surprised her. So you don't believe it's true? That he's really dead? Malden glanced back to her, his steely gaze like a shock to her system. Our dear head patron frequently disappears for long periods of time, and I've never been worried. But this time is different. Back in June when I was at my parents' summer home, I felt a jolt, like I'd been kicked in the back of the head by a horse, said Nadia. Everyone else I know from the halls felt the same thing. If he were truly dead, we would know. But it's clear that he's missing, that much is true, said Malden. What will happen to the halls? She asked. Malden shifted as if he recognized who he was talking to, and he let a smile rise to his lips. I'm sorry. Wool gathering. You came here about your fifth-year focus. Have you decided what you want to study? Nadia placed her hands behind her back. Demonology. Not how to summon them, of course. But I was doing some research about the city, and it looks like there's been a steady increase in demon sightings, year over year, for quite some time. If this trend continues, it could be catastrophic, especially because I don't think they're all purposeful summonings, or at least my limited research doesn't suggest that. But that's one of the aspects that I want to investigate. My preferred professor, well, I guess the only professor really due to his expertise, would be Professor Sinclair. While she was speaking, Patron Malden's lips slowly curled into an apologetic smile. By the time she was done, she had to work not to clench her hands into fists. It's an excellent project. Top-notch, really. But I'm afraid you're too late. I've already given another fourth-year permission to work with Professor Sinclair on their project, and after the injuries he sustained last year, he's asked to keep the number of his fourth-year students to 1. Her gut slowly hollowed out with the news that the only professor capable of guiding her was unavailable. She'd been working the last few months on the pre-work to take to Professor Sinclair, but now that wouldn't even be necessary. "Aye," said Nadia, looking out the window. "My apologies, Miss Park. I'm sure you've worked quite hard, but you'll have to choose another topic and professor," he said. "But I don't understand. I didn't know it was first come, first serve. I thought the professors were supposed to consider all projects first," she asked. Patron Malden squeezed his lips together before speaking. "Unfortunate circumstances for you. I'm sure your project was brilliant, but I felt the other was necessary regardless of any challenges." In a fit of desperation she blurted out, "What about you? Could you teach me?" Patron Malden sat back in his chair. She could see by the light in his eyes he was actually contemplating it. In her head she tried not to get excited. That anticipation came to a crashing end when he said, "I cannot. My responsibilities, especially given the topic we were just discussing, preclude me from taking students. Though it pains me to say as much, because I would enjoy working with you, Nadia. I see a lot of myself in you." The mix of frustration and pride was a nauseating cocktail of emotions. Nadia just wanted to go down to one of the practice rooms and let loose some rage magic. "Thank you, Patron Malden. That's very kind of you," she said, looking down at her shoes. "I'm not just trying to make you feel better when I say that," he said. "You know you have one of the highest Merlin scores that we've ever had in this hall. Probably as high as mine was at your age, which means you'll only get stronger. But like me at your age, I didn't know how to tap into all that power. It scared me. I spent a lot of time not using magic in those early days, distracting myself with tasks like being mayor of Philadelphia." The comment only reminded her that he was much older than he looked, preserved by sorcery. If she survived her studies, she too could one day live as long as him, or longer. "I'm trying to use all my potential," said Nadia. "But when I reach too deep, I fear that I'll be injured somehow. Those depths scare me." And they should. Fear is a reasonable reaction. But you need to take the reins off that power, find what your limits are, even as you fear death. He nodded sagely. "I suggest you find a project that forces you to do just that. The other project, while noble of intent, wouldn't have let you stretch yourself." Nadia swallowed. "Thank you. I will think on it." "Good," he said with a wink. "See me when you're ready again. I look forward to hearing about your new project." Nadia was turning to leave the library, when a question popped into her head. "Patron Malden, may I ask who it was that beat me to Professor Sinclair?" she asked. He blinked twice before speaking softly. "I think you know the answer to that question, Miss Park." A few days after the bad news from Patron Malden, Nadia went in search of her sister. They hadn't talked much after the incident in the kill room. It made her heart ache to think that a rift had come between them. While Nadia knew that mistaking the intent of the gathering hadn't helped her cause, she was sure that Victoria was poisoning her sister's mind against her. Otherwise, why would she be constantly hanging around Victoria, never bothering to stop by when they lived in the same hall? When she asked around in the dining area, a second year sent Nadia to the infirmary, where they'd seen Allison last. Worried that she'd been hurt during class, Nadia hurried there, finding her sister strolling out with a small bottle in her hand. Nadia ran up to her sister and set her hand on her forearm. "Are you okay?" Allison wrinkled her nose. "Yeah. What's this all about?" "I was just coming to see you. It feels like it's been forever and we're in the same hall, and I heard you were here and was afraid you were hurt." "You're not hurt, are you?" asked Nadia. Her sister, who had a stockier frame like their father, pulled her arm away. "You don't have to be my mom here," said Allison. "I'm not meaning to," said Nadia. Allison bunched up her lips. "Meaning to? At least you acknowledge that's what you're doing." Nadia sighed. As she looked down at her feet, she caught a glimpse of the label on the plastic bottle. "Distilled nightshade?" asked Nadia, looking into her sister's exasperated face as she shoved the bottle into a pocket. "What's going on? That's serious stuff." You shouldn't be messing around with that as a first year. Alison held her palm out. Nadia, stop. I know what I'm doing. This involves Victoria, doesn't it? You really need to stop hanging out with her. She's bad news, said Nadia. She's not what you think, said Alison. She's exactly what I think. I've known her for 4 years. She's only hanging out with you to hurt me somehow, said Nadia. Oh, this is all about you now, asked Alison, crossing her arms. I'm sorry, Ali, I don't want to see you get hurt, said Nadia, reaching out to her sister, only to have her pull away. Don't worry, Nads, I won't. Alison stormed down the hall, leaving Nadia feeling empty inside. In the months afterwards, Nadia threw herself into finding a new project for her 5th-year focus. The suggestion to learn how to push magic to her limit was at first daunting, but then grew more intriguing as she researched it. It was natural to be hesitant when wielding phase, the raw stuff of magic. Phase was toxic to human minds unless a resistance had been built up. Prolonged exposure without protection led people to madness, which was why the patron system was the only way the use of magic had expanded in the last century. A patron, through a psychic link, protected their students from the harmful effects of phase until they were strong enough to exist on their own. Typically, it took about 3 decades of heavy use to build up the proper resistances, but a lot of variables depended on the user. Nadia had never felt like she'd reached the limits of her abilities because she'd spent the majority of her life purposely not using phase, and now that she was free to do so under the protection of the patron system, it was hard to overcome those deep-seated hesitancies. To help her push past those limits, Nadia decided that her focus would be on the essence of phase itself. The raw stuff of magic was poorly understood, as it was difficult to capture without changing it into a new form. She started by building a Philium device, which could detect excess phase that lingered after a spell was cast. The amount of off phase correlated roughly to the amount used, which was why the burnt ozone smell lingered afterwards. The Philium device was made from alternating sheets of micro-titanium and magically softened obsidian, which would bend in the presence of phase. The sheets were bound between 2 sensors that could detect deflection, giving a measurement of excess phase, which could be converted into the amount used in a spell. The device would even work on phase used at a relative distance because of the obsidian. It was the afternoon of New Year's Eve. Nadia was on the 5th floor of the obelisk in a stainless steel lab, calibrating the device, which had taken nearly a month to build. The idea for her 5th-year focus would be to develop techniques for maximizing phase use. From her research, she knew that psychological effects were the biggest driver of phase: fear for self, fear of others, hatred, love, mostly the strong emotions. As Patron Malden liked to say, the greatest magics exist at the precipice of life and death. Nadia fired a force bolt down a long concrete hallway that was used for testing directed spells. After the ghostly ball impacted into the wall, disappearing into faint mist, she checked the metering on the Philium device and then recorded the result. She'd been firing each element into the wall, trying to keep the amount of phase she used the same, confirming if the device was consistent. As she was scribbling the answer into her notebook, Professor Kingsley leaned through the open door in a silver dress that hugged her tiny body, dark curls bouncing around her cherubic face. Miss Park, I appreciate your dedication to your craft, but it is a night to let loose. You should get out of here. I know I plan on having a good time tonight, she said in her light English accent. Don't worry. I'm going to catch up to my sister later at the Smoke and Amber, said Nadia. Before midnight? Asked Professor Kingsley. Of course, Professor, said Nadia with a grin. I'll be there a few minutes before anyway. Professor Kingsley drummed her bright red nails against the doorframe, raising an eyebrow. The two of you are quite the pair. I know you've both been competing for best mage of your year since day one, but both of you really should learn to enjoy yourself. You're going to have a long life ahead of you, you don't want to burn out before you get there. Nadia wrinkled her forehead. Victoria. Yes, she's down in the lower levels working on Merlin knows whatever project, just like you. On a day you should be getting out and sowing your oats, said Professor Kingsley. I'll go out, Professor. I swear, said Nadia. That's my girl, said Professor Kingsley with a wink. Before she swung back out the door she said, and don't forget to voodoo your vagina. You don't want to earn a trip to Golden Willow later. Barely containing her laughter, Nadia said, "Begone, Professor. I'll be good." Checking the time, Nadia realized she was going to be later than she'd anticipated, so she pulled out her phone and called her sister, only to have it go to voicemail. It was unusual for her sister not to answer, but maybe the music was too loud. Nadia threw her phone back in her bag and went back to work, quietly chuckling at her interaction with Professor Kingsley, who was everyone's favorite professor in Coterie by a large margin. A while later, as Nadia started checking the time, thinking she might need to wrap up and join the party, the Philium device hummed suddenly before making ticking noises like an engine cooling. Nadia checked the readout to find an absurdly high value of phase represented. What the? She tapped on the device, thinking it was malfunctioning, and it spiked briefly before returning to a steady low number. A quick glance around the room proved that nothing nearby was causing the interference. The device could pick up phase use further away, but she hadn't determined its range yet. Nadia couldn't imagine that it could reach further than the obelisk, since the building was heavily warded, which meant the high phase use was coming from inside. That itself wasn't particularly worrisome, it was a hall filled with mages, but the level of usage surprised her. There were few mages in Coterie that could achieve that level. As her mind spun into high gear, considering the possibilities, she noticed the clock again. "Enough work, Nadia," she said, then followed up with a chuckle. "You know you're working too hard when you refer to yourself in the third person." She switched the Philium device off and grabbed her shoulder bag, knocking the whole thing off the desk in her haste. A clatter of items spilled onto the floor. Nadia crouched down to scoop up the syringe of Citadel antidote left over from her trinkets class, when she noticed a small vial filled with a section of bloody rag. A few drops of liquid blood sloshed around the curve of the bottom. It took a moment to remember she'd scraped the blood off the floor in the lower-level kill room. "Don't worry about it," she told herself. "There are a lot of different creatures that have blood that won't congeal." As she stood up, throwing the syringe and vial back into the shoulder bag, she couldn't help but think about the likelihood of a northern void snake or a spotted fook being inside the walls of Coterie. Or any of the other creatures that had blood that could stay liquid after many months. The only plausible creature, if you could call it that, would be certain classes of demons. As the connections were made between the blood, the kill room, and her topic of study, a name slipped from Nadia's lips. Victoria. Her rival was the only one left in Coterie, the only one with enough phase to accomplish the dangerous task of summoning a demon. Nadia thought back to the competition at the beginning of the year. She'd never realized until then how strong Victoria was, which correlated with the high phase readings on the meter. A nagging concern made her pull out her phone and dial up her sister a second time. "Come on," she said. "Pick up." When it went to voicemail, she headed towards the basement of the obelisk where the kill rooms were located. She heard the scream before she reached the door. She burst in to find her sister strapped to a chair with a bald figure standing over her. Nadia didn't make the connection until she saw the wig sitting on the table. A stunning bolt flew from her hands before Victoria could turn around. She hit her directly in the back, which should have knocked her on her ass. Victoria turned, revealing two small nubs where horns had been filed down on the crown of her bald head. "You monster, get away from my sister," said Nadia, reaching deep into her reserves of phase for her next spell. To her surprise, Victoria made no move to defend herself, staring back with what could only be resigned apathy. But Nadia wasn't about to waste her chance to save her sister. The next stunning strike wasn't just going to knock Victoria down. She dug deep, pulling up every ounce of phase she had in her system. "Nadia, stop." The words came not from Victoria, but from her sister, who was sitting up in the chair. Nadia held her spell, the phase in her mind making her dizzy, the inside of her nostrils burning with ozone. It's not what it looks like. Stop, you'll only regret it, said Allison, standing up and pulling a needle from her arm. The only thing that kept Nadia from unleashing her spell was the fact that Victoria still stood with her arms at her side, lips curled towards the concrete. Her rival had always carried an inner light as if nothing could go wrong for her, but standing in the center of the kill room without her wig, showing the demonic heritage that she'd always tried to hide, she looked like a prisoner caught trying to escape. Releasing the phase without using it made Nadia nauseous, but she fought through the vertigo, not letting her expression change. What's going on? Tell me. Tell me now, said Nadia as she swallowed back bile. Isn't it obvious? Asked Victoria, face racked with pain. Allison stepped in front. She's sick. I've been trying to help her. That doesn't explain anything, said Nadia, gesturing towards the wig. Ali, said Victoria, putting a hand on her sister's shoulder. Let me explain it to her. She's not going to understand unless I tell her everything. What she does with that information is up to her. After Allison stepped out of the way, Victoria continued, as you well know, my parents are famous Coterie mages, considered some of the strongest of their generation. But they didn't come by that strength honestly. Honestly. Did they make a deal with a supernatural creature? Or get possessed? Asked Nadia. Worse, said Victoria. A deal with a demon will usually come back to haunt the dealmaker, and possession is too hard to control, but there's another way, a way only spoken about by those who know. Demonic infusion. It wasn't hard to figure out who the only those who know were because the Dreadmarshers only associated with a select group, the richest of the rich, mostly Coterie, but a few from other halls. They killed and ate a demon? Asked Nadia, trying not to imagine the revolting image. Not exactly. But the result is they became much more powerful than they were before, said Victoria. And this changed them, which they passed on to you, said Nadia, making the connections. Yes, said Victoria. Normally, only one parent would do it because of the risks for children, but my parents are arrogant. Neither wanted to give up the chance for such power. Leading to you, said Nadia. Which is why I couldn't break your steel ball snake in the game. Victoria touched her horn nubs. Exactly. But it comes with a price, and I don't think my body is capable of paying it, not easily. Shadows below, that's terrible, said Nadia. I'm so sorry. But how did my sister become involved? An accident, really, said Victoria, shaking her head. I accidentally let my enchantments weaken, allowing her to see the real me. I thought she would reveal my true self, but instead she offered to help. The blood transfer, along with other medicines we've been experimenting with, have allowed me to fight the changes. So you aren't this perfect creation, said Nadia. I was always so jealous of how easy you made it look. Now I feel stupid. Here I've been thinking we're rivals to be the best in the class, when I should have been helping you. Victoria raised an eyebrow. We are rivals trying to be the best in the class, but I appreciate the sentiment. Nadia let a smile rise to her lips, which brought the same to Victoria's. Is this what you're planning to do for your fifth-year focus? Asked Nadia. Victoria skewed her mouth to the side. I'm sorry. I know you wanted Professor Sinclair as well. So Patron Malden knows, said Nadia, understanding why there'd been no debate about the choice. He wants me to find a way to fight the change, said Victoria, keeping her expression tight. Though she hadn't meant to, Victoria had revealed a secret about Patron Malden. Her eyes widened slightly in realization. Don't worry, I can keep a secret, said Nadia. About all of it. Thank you. Victoria glanced at her shoes. What was it that you were planning with Sinclair? Nadia bit her lower lip. I'd rather not, if that's all right with you. Fair enough, replied Victoria. What I still don't understand is how it's even possible to become demonically infused, Nadia said. Well, nobody knows exactly what phase is, we know its raw power. We know we can change things with it, like adding heat to water to turn it to steam. One theory is that all supernatural creatures are just regular beings that were changed by phase over time until they became a new creature, said Victoria. Remembering what Patron Malden had said to her about her own strength, Nadia blurted out, "Wait, does that mean that?" She looked to Alison, who glanced sideways at Victoria with a grin. "No," said Victoria, smirking. "You come by your magical strength honestly, or at least if you have supernatural heritage in your past, it's not demonic. We tested Alison." Nadia scrunched up her face. "I'm sorry that I'm relieved, that's rude of me." "It's okay. I understand given the potential complications," said Victoria, touching her nubs. "So what now?" The three of them looked between each other until Alison said, "We party like it's almost 2004. After a brief silence they broke into laughter. Nadia checked the time. "We still have a couple of hours if we hurry. I'm sure everyone's well into their binges at the bar. We still have more work to do. I've been putting it off but I cannot any longer," said Victoria. "Can we meet you upstairs?" "Great," said Nadia, feeling a giant load off her chest. "I was in the middle of my work. I'll finish what I was doing and meet you then." With the light returned to her eyes, Victoria said, "You know everyone's going to crap a dragon when we walk into the smoke and amber together." "2 dragons if we do it arm in arm," said Nadia, cocking a smile. "Let's do it," said Victoria with a wink. "I don't know how to thank you." "You can thank me by letting me help you with your project next year since it seems you've already signed up my sister," said Nadia. "You're kidding. I mean, of course you aren't." "Yes, absolutely yes," said Victoria, eyes rounding. Before Nadia could do anything else, Victoria ran over and threw her arms around her. The hug only lasted a moment because Victoria seemed to catch herself, but as she stepped away she thumbed away a tear. Nadia took that moment to leave, feeling like she was floating across the ground both from the revelations and the changing of their rivalry. Not that she wasn't still going to try and be the best, but it would be a different competition from there on out. As she made her way back to the laboratory, Nadia thought about the research that she'd had to set aside, and how it might be useful to Victoria. Nadia planned on cleaning up before the evening's festivities, but when she saw the Philium device, a thought struck her like a gong. If Victoria wasn't the source of phase, who was? She asked aloud. Frowning, Nadia switched on the device only to find it spiked higher than before, pulsing with even larger peaks. "Merlin's tits on a stick," she muttered. Based on a hunch, Nadia rotated the heavy device, hoping she could get a better sense of where the source was located. When she turned it perpendicular, the phase reading maxed out the sensor. She knew instantly where it was coming from, the professor's private research areas, but her gut twisted as she thought about the possibilities of who might be using them and for what purpose. Even before she'd turned off the device, she knew she would go investigate, if only for her curiosity. "I've got an hour to kill anyway," said Nadia as she headed down the hall towards the restricted section of the obelisk. She easily bypassed the wards, which were more to keep the first and second-year students from getting hurt accidentally, strolling casually down the hall filled with portraits of previous professors. When she reached the professor's private kill room, the smell of burning ozone hit her nose, making it wrinkle. The door wards were activated, which meant that whatever was going on inside the room was dangerous enough to possibly trigger the death of everyone inside. Nadia put her hand on the wall, feeling a faint vibration. The room was insulated to keep anyone from listening in, but there was a trick she had learned in her 3rd year that might give her a peek into the room. She pulled a paper clip out of her bag, unfolded it, and placed a charm on it that turned it into an insulator. After confirming she'd performed the spell correctly, Nadia shoved the wire into the electrical socket on the lower wall near the door. A brief spark shot from the hole, but the charm kept the paperclip from conducting the current. She used a piece of quickly chewed gum to hold the wire in the socket. Sitting on the ground next to the protruding wire, Nadia used wire clippers to strip the rubber away from a pair of earbuds and wrapped the end of it around the wire. A brief spell later, Nadia placed the bud in her ear, hearing faint static. The trick worked by using the room's electrical system as a listening device, but it needed the right connection. Nadia wiggled the paperclip, and voices rose from the static. "It's as painful as you want," said a voice that could only be Patron Malden's. "I can keep you in this cage as long as I want. You are my prisoner." Nadia was so surprised by the last part she jerked away from the bud but quickly shoved it back in her ear, catching the reply, which sounded like a voice made of warmed honey. "Deluded you are to think you can hold me. Already I find weakness in your so-called cage of sticks, brittle and quick to break," said the second voice. Even through the static-filled connection, Nadia sensed the power of the second speaker. But who could Patron Malden have in the room, and why was he keeping them a prisoner? The immediate answer made her sick to even think about it. "Tell me what happened to Invictus," said Patron Malden. "Tell me, Elocian, and I will let you return to your infernal home." If she'd been surprised previously, this time she was stunned into immobility. Patron Malden had always warned them that demon summoning was not to be attempted, not even by the professors. But this was worse than that. Elocian was a major demon, a powerful being that was often called the Lord of Spies or the Prince of Whispers. To call upon this demon for information was to bring risk to the city itself. But this was the second revelation about demons for the night, which told her that the only thing she should be surprised about was her naivete. "Release me now or suffer consequences." "My whispers slip through even the toughest walls," said Elocian. A moment later, a horrid scream forced Nadia to pull the bud out. Whatever Malden had done, it had caused the demon pain. "Answer me now," growled Malden through the static. Hoarse and breathing heavily, Elocian responded, "Fool you are to think that I have not prepared for this day. Your clumsy questing only allowed me to dangle the hook, which now I set in earnest." "You don't scare me, demon," said Malden. "I know what you truly want, Malden Antarist." The demon said his name with relish, as if it were a fine meal. "Get my name out of your mouth," said Malden aggressively, but Nadia could hear the fear in his voice, which made her wonder if she should try to call for help. "The waft and weft of your past twirl like twine around my fingers. While you looked for me, I whispered for you. I know what it is you truly desire in your heart of hearts. It is not the truth of Invictus but his demise you wish," said Elocian. "No," said Malden, quick and forceful. "Despite my disagreements, I would not wish him ill. He is the rock that holds the halls together, but if he is no longer with us, then I must undertake the laborious task of replacing him, if such a thing can be done." "The lie you tell yourself to justify your actions," said Elocian. "But matter not, as it is my time to twist the knife." "A bluff," said Malden, his voice coming through the wire bold and confident. "I have you contained within my circle. The summoning was long and difficult, but I performed it perfectly. You are my prisoner. Answer my question. What happened to Invictus?" Nadia didn't get to hear what happened next, because there was a huge burst of static. When it subsided, all she could hear was choking. When Elocian spoke again, his voice was different, more arrogant, as if he had nothing more to worry about. "Silver dust, you use a potent barrier against my magics, but know you not that it was cut with fine tin until now," said Elocian. A cold realization settled onto Nadia, until her bones felt as ice. She leaned back, examining the room's wards, which had been silenced. Then a sharp pain shot through her head, like an ice pick to the base of the skull, and she could not deny its meaning. A glance down the hall revealed an escape path should she choose, but as her heart thundered in her ears, she knew it was not the path she would take. Unwarded, the door opened easily, revealing an octagonal room 40 feet in diameter, the walls covered in thin glass, holding back deathgeists from annihilating anyone in the room, even the demon lord. But the runes had been deactivated, and Nadia saw why. On the far side stood the demon, while the room was awash in unspent phase from the summoning. Elocian, Lord of Spies, was not the handsome figure that his voice had made him out to be, though his face was not unbecoming. Stretching from his shoulders were two powerful tentacles, which had Patron Malden around the neck, which he struggled against. The demon looked at Nadia, revealing its bone-white teeth. "Run away, girl," said the demon. The honeyed voice was like a sledgehammer to her mind. She took a step towards the door before taking back control of her feet. "Precious is this futile resistance," said Elocian as it squeezed the tentacles tighter around Malden's neck. "But worry you not. When I am finished, pet of mine he will be, and I will rule this hall from within." "No," said Nadia. Elocian pulled back one set of tentacles, which spread into 3 separate lengths, which it placed on Malden's midsection. His screams cut through the room, leaving her shaken. Nadia fired a force bolt at the demon, which it easily swatted away. "A naughty pet to bite its master," said Elocian. "So shall every blow return on you 100-fold, but if you beg forgiveness, then merciful shall I be." The will to fight drained away with the thought of what the demon lord could do to her, especially if it finished taking control of Malden's mind. By the way his eyes were rolled back into his head, she knew it wouldn't be long. A fear-filled part of her considered what was about to happen, and she almost threw herself on the ground in hopes that groveling might save her from the worst of what might come. But as much as that lizard part of her brain tried to take control, she pushed back, knowing that she would never forgive herself if she gave in. "No," she said, even though it hurt to say it. With one glance around the room, she knew what it was that she had to do, and based on the hazy clouds covering Malden's eyes, she had little time left to do it. As she reached back towards the door, she saw Victoria and Allison running down the hallway towards her. She almost faltered in her plan, letting the door slow as it closed, but knew that even the 3 of them could not win against the demon lord. With a flick of her wrist and a word of command, Nadia set the wards again. Moments later, a fist pounded on the door, followed by muffled shouting. "I can't," Nadia said to the door, then softer while shaking her head, "I can't." Elocian's head snapped around. "My pet, what is it you think you will accomplish?" A pit opened in Nadia's stomach. "Ending this." "You have not the power to defy me," said Elocian, taking a step towards Nadia, while dragging Patron Malden behind him with a pale blue tentacle. "2 pets I can make, and many more." Nadia ignored the banging on the door, and reached deep into her mind to summon the phase necessary for what she planned. When she had delved into her reserves, plumbing phase until her nostrils burned and her eyes watered, Nadia brought forth a bonfire between her hands that dripped from the air, singeing her eyebrows in its fiery intensity. A spark against the void. "Nothing in your power can compete against me," said Elocian, releasing Malden's midsection with its tentacles and reaching towards her. The suckers on the limbs had tiny tooth-filled mouths on them. "It's not me you have to worry about," said Nadia as she launched her fireball at the demon, which forced it to deflect the magics with both its tentacles. The attack had 2 effects that she desired. The first was to get Malden free of the demon. The second was to distract it from her true purpose. As the demon loped after her on stilted legs with knees that bent backwards like a satyr's, Nadia skirted around the summoning circle. Even cut with tin, the silver dust would be painful to the demon. Elocian made a wide loop to follow, calling after her, "An example you will be, my pet, for all to know the price of resistance." Reaching the opposite side with the demon on her tail, Nadia released her hold on the door wards. Victoria and Allison stumbled into the room, snapping straight from shock upon seeing what had transpired. "Get Malden out of here," yelled Nadia, gesturing towards the fallen patron. Elocian made a haughty gurgling noise in its throat, which Nadia interpreted as disgust, before turning back towards the patron. With no time for complex magics, Nadia fired a force bolt at the demon lord's unprotected back, hoping to get its attention. "Hurry, go," she yelled when the 2 girls hesitated, but then they surged forward, grabbing the unconscious patron to drag him from the room. Alosian's awkward gait did not make the demon a speedy pursuer, but it would cut them off, so Nadia threw force bolts at its knees hoping to slow it. The impact wobbled the demon, keeping it from catching Victoria and Alison. As the door slammed shut, her sister's voice tugged on her heart. Nadia, no. Before anyone could have second thoughts, herself included, Nadia gave the command to reactivate the wards, and Alosian turned on her. Fool pet, think to break you I cannot, asked the demon as its tentacle arms reached for her. She backed away, stepping into the circle. Much it helped your master, said Alosian with its teeth bared. As much it will help you. I'll give you one warning. Leave this plane of your own volition, or you will find yourself a husk, said Nadia, holding her hands out. Threaten me, think you can, asked Alosian. After control I take, I will feed you to your friends. Nadia took one last glance at the door. She'd made her decision, but she hoped Alison would understand why it had to be done this way. When Alosian had broken through the circle and taken control of Malden, it had clearly known enough to silence the wards before they triggered. Nadia imagined the attack had happened so quickly that Malden hadn't seen it coming. But this worked in reverse in much the same way. Nadia threw her energy towards the runes in the walls to reactivate them, while the demon lord was present in the room. Alosian didn't comprehend her intent at first, until the runes began to reactivate, lighting up the incorporeal creatures within. Much to her dismay, Alosian managed to block her from triggering the runes. She hadn't dug deep enough, hadn't used enough phase in her bid to end them both. Strong enough you think, foolish pet, said Alosian, and the demon lord advanced on her, kicking the silver dust away as it hissed against its foot. Resemblance I see of the girl outside. She shall be my first, you watch. As she fought against Alosian, will against will for control of the runes, the words of Patron Malden from earlier in the year came back to her. The greatest magics occur at the precipice of life and death. It had sounded pretentious at the time, a trite saying meant to bolster the speaker's importance. But as the demon lord Alosian advanced on her, the truth came back on Nadia in full. If she failed, her sister would be the first one to feel the demon's wrath. Nothing in her life had prepared her for that moment. All the times she'd competed against Victoria, she'd always come up short. She couldn't fail against the demon lord. It wasn't that Alosian would take control of Malden, enslave the whole of Coterie to its will, and through him destroy the 100 halls. That was meaningless to Nadia in comparison to her sister, Alison, who had followed her to this place in hopes of learning magic, to be like her older sister. Before, Nadia had been using her phase as if it were a tool separate from her, but now with her sister's life at stake, she accessed it as if it were a part of herself. Every cell of her being squeezed phase from the ether, every thought was lashed to dragging it from the depths of her mind. The surge of power surprised the demon lord as it was reaching towards her, confident that it would be victorious. But even then, it was not enough. Nadia found levels she didn't know existed, and as the torrent of power flowed from her, she realized why. The body was a conduit for phase, but not strengthened against it. The raw stuff of magic would tear it apart. As she threw her power against the runes, she destroyed herself in turn, until she felt her heart giving out from the strain. As the demon tentacles slipped towards her neck, Nadia broke through the resistance. The runes came to life as her chest seized with pain, forcing her to her knees and then onto her side. The torrent of phase had stilled her heart, much like a great electrical current. Through her spotted vision, she saw the demon lord pull away. Glass shattered, and an unholy keening filled her mind. The Deathgeists rushed towards them in a wave of murderous mist. Forced between escape and annihilation, Alosian took the former, slipping back through the rip that had brought it to the halls, but not before the Deathgeists had torn into its skin. But there would be no respite for Nadia Park. As the Deathgeists descended on her, she welcomed the embrace of eternity, knowing that for a brief, terrible moment, she had been the most powerful mage in the world. The ward runes on the door blared red, as crimson as the tattered clothes on Patron Malden. Alison held her hands over his midsection, where the demon had ripped away his flesh, trying to stop the bleeding until Victoria could return with the emergency kit. But it wasn't Malden's health that worried her, even though his death would trigger a descent into madness for her. It was the bright red pulsing wards on the door. As first years, the professors had warned them what they meant, prepared them for the fact that it would happen during their tenure in Coterie, because it always seemed to happen every few years when young mages grew foolish. Magic was dangerous, especially in a hall that pushed the limits. Alison just hadn't thought it would be her sister on the other side of those red wards. When Victoria returned, she already had the adrenaline elixir unstopped. "Alison, you're not holding firm enough," said Victoria frantically, tilting Malden's unconscious head back to pour the potion down his throat. But when Victoria's gaze flitted up to the door, she paled and added, "Sorry." With the alchemical solution coursing through his veins, Patron Malden snapped awake, crying out in pain as Alison shoved heavy balls of gauze onto his stomach to soak up the blood. He pushed her away, sliding into a sitting position. His arm was covered in a watery casing that throbbed as if a creature lay beneath, while his right eye looked reptilian. Alison didn't know if the demon had caused the change, or if the attack had brought out his heritage. After rooting through the emergency kit, Patron Malden muttered an incantation and poured a dusty mixture into his wounds that caused him to cry out. He fell back against the wall, covered in sweat, blood and mucus. Alison was sitting a few feet away, her hands covered in his blood, trying not to think about the door, when the red wards faded to charcoal grey, and a mechanism inside the door clicked, sending her heart soaring. As she climbed to her feet, Patron Malden shook her off. "You don't want to go in there." But Alison couldn't bear not to know for certain, to see her one last time, even if it hurt to look at her gruesome body. A cold silence settled onto her, as if she was alone in the woods during a winter storm. The emptiness went to her bones. Alison went into the kill room alone, while Victoria tended to Patron Malden's wounds. A carpet of broken glass lay scattered around the perimeter of the room, then within that was a silvery circle, while splayed in the center of it all was her sister. Her limbs froze as she thought about all the times they used to curl on the bed together reading tomes about the latest magical theories, the countless times they'd speculated which hall they would end up in, almost always Coterie, and the giggling when they'd played 5 Elements until the late hours of the night. Nadia had always been her rock, her North Star. When Alison came to Coterie, she'd worried that she would be an annoyance to her older sister, so she'd glommed on to Victoria. Now her older sister lay fallen amid a circle of silver dust. She made the slow procession across the room. When she reached her sister, her whole body was numb. Nadia's eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, and her mouth was curved into a grimace. "I wish there was more time," said Alison. "I didn't get to do real magic with you in Coterie." She crouched down, placing a hand on her sister's still warm arm. It was only then that she remembered what she'd been told about the Deathgeists upon her first days in Coterie. That they would kill anything alive, and that the results would be horrific. It was why Patron Malden had warned her not to enter. "Nadia!" Alison shot up, sprinting back outside to rummage through the emergency kit, while the other two looked at her as if she'd gone mad. She grabbed the elixir of adrenaline and rushed back to her sister, immediately scooping her head up and in one motion, throwing the liquid down her throat, massaging as it went down. "Come on," said Alison as she shook her sister lightly. "Please." When nothing happened, Alison figured that she'd been wrong about her sister dying before the Deathgeists had been summoned, or that it had been too long since she had died. The spark of hope faded until it was only cold misery. The last thing Nadia remembered was the room fading from vision. Then she was catapulted out of the dark, back into her body, a surge of energy restarting her heart and making her sit right up. Nadia took a wheezing inward breath as her sister nearly fell over in shock. Every cell in her body felt like it was on fire from channeling so much phase. Nadia bent over, trying not to vomit on the floor as her sister patted her on the back. "You're alive," said Alison, but Nadia couldn't respond. Her throat burned as if she'd been gargling lava. "Shadows below," said Victoria, who had come upon the scene, her arms covered in blood. "How the hell?" Nadia blinked. Even though the battle with the Demon Lord had only been a few minutes ago, it felt like a lifetime. She looked to the broken glass and the silver circle, barely comprehending what had happened. Limping through the doorway, his arm cradled to his chest, was Patron Malden. Even through her post-death haze, Nadia knew that he'd been changed somehow. "Well, this is a surprise," said Patron Malden, arching a tired eyebrow. "But I don't understand," said Victoria, shaking her head. "How is this possible?" Nadia couldn't answer, as even her teeth and tongue ached, but her sister did for her. "She died before the Deathgeists reached her, though I don't know how," said Alison. "She found her limits," said Patron Malden, appraising her with his mouth skewed to the side. "And pushed past them, way past them. Farther than even I've ever dared." Nadia wanted to sleep for a month, but having Malden bring up her limits reminded her of why she had to push back them in the first place. She managed to spit out a few words, though it hurt. "No demons," she said. Patron Malden nodded. "It was a mistake. Hubris. I thought myself smarter than I was. Elosian tricked me, and I would have paid for it with my life, except for you, Nadia." "But why?" asked Victoria, turning on their patron. He looked like he wasn't going to answer, so Nadia grunted, "Invictus." He blew a breath out his nose. "It appears there is no hiding anything from you." "Yes, Invictus. I'm afraid that he's gone forever. I wanted to know the truth, so I could better advise my fellow patrons on the course of action going forward. We live in dangerous times without him. I fear for what his absence will mean for the 100 Halls." Silence settled on the four of them while they contemplated the patron's words, until Alison made a noise of surprise in her throat. "It's almost midnight," she said. "Not the party you were expecting," said Patron Malden. "Come, let us get your sister on her feet. A bit of walking will do her some good. We can take her to my office and watch the fireworks while she rests." Victoria and her sister helped Nadia to her feet. After the first few limp steps, she managed to get solid footing, though she let her weight rest on their shoulders. The four of them made an awful procession, but they made it to Patron Malden's office before midnight. He gave up his huge leather-bound desk chair for Nadia, and had Victoria pour them each a snifter of scotch from his private collection. The pain had mostly receded, so Nadia could actually focus on the view of the spire at the center of the city, where a countdown clock was displayed on the building with a realistic illusion. "What about your arm?" asked Alison as they watched the final minutes pass by. His arm cradled to his chest within its watery casing, Patron Malden frowned. "Drastic measures, I'm afraid. But enough about that, let us celebrate an unexpected victory," he said, capturing his glass of scotch with his good hand. Finding her voice again, Nadia asked, "Change your mind about my fifth-year focus?" With a cocked smile, Patron Malden said, "I would love to be your mentor." As the clock on the spire began to count down from 10, Patron Malden raised his glass. Nadia barely had any energy, but she managed to lift hers a few centimeters off the table. He gave her a wink. "To Nadia's triumph." This has been Nadia's Triumph by Thomas K. Carpenter.